I did my graduate work in Ukraine in the 1990s. I lived near Ukrainian in the 1990s, 1995, 1996. I've also was present at both the Orange Revolution and Euromaidan, the Revolution of Dignity. And I've written 3 books. The first is Competitive Authoritarianism, Hybrid Regimes After the Cold War, in which I have proposed with Stephen Levitsky a kind of a regime type that exists somewhere in between democracy and authoritarianism. I have also written Pluralism by Default, which is a book actually about Ukraine and the sources of Ukraine's very dynamic pluralism and democracy. Finally, most recently, I have come out with a book with Stephen Levitsky that's much more historical on revolution and dictatorship, which is about sort of revolutionary regimes in the old sense, countries like the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, and looks at why those regimes that were born of violent struggle have been so durable. So that is my most recent book, Revolution and Dictatorship. Before I start, I want to just thank the Kiev School of Economics. It's been a real pleasure working with the Kiev School of Economics. It's been, I think, a real inspiration for all of us. Currently, we have a wonderful joint degree program between the Kiev School of Economics and the Munk School, which is where I'm based. Okay, so today I want to talk about the impact of Russia's invasion on sort of global politics. In a nutshell, that I want to argue that the invasion basically forced us to rethink the impact of economic and other forms of integration on democracy and liberalism. And basically that whereas before, there was this idea that integration would necessarily promote liberalization and democracy. Now I think those views have been challenged and have been replaced by what might be called a sort of new containment, which is sort of a kind of efforts to sort of separate the West and the East. So to begin, I want to, until recently, there was this idea of liberal transnationalism, which was this idea that is very popular in many works, Thomas Friedman and others, that trade and other forms of integration, immigration and the like, would facilitate broader global liberalization of politics. Liberal transnationalists argue that ties to the West promote democracy by encouraging the spread of ideas and greater dependence on the democratic West. These ideas were central to the European Union, but also to sort of the German policy of Ostpolitik from the 1970s. You see Willy Brandt and Leonid Brezhnev. And the idea was that rather than confronting the Soviet Union in sort of Cold War style, that a much better policy was to engage them and increase trade, and that would gradually lead to sort of the liberalization on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Now, many Germans credit Ostpolitik with ending the Cold War. I think that is not much evidence that Ostpolitik was responsible for the end of the Cold War. Nonetheless, I think these ideas aren't crazy. Indeed, that I have proposed in my second book, my first book, a very similar argument that underlay Ostpolitik, which is the idea that social, economic, media, and intergovernmental ties between the West, the US and European Union, and other parts of the world leads to democracy. So the idea here is that increased ties does two things. First, it increases information about abuses by autocratic governments in the West. You have more, ties, more people find out about abuses. Second, the argument is that that we made in 2010 is that by increasing trade, you basically create groups with a stake in good ties to the West. In other words, groups that may not themselves believe in democracy, but who want to preserve these economic ties and therefore are willing to go along with democracy. To quote one EU official from the 1970s, who said, you can never prevent an adventurer from trying to overthrow the government if he is backed by real economic powers, the banks and the businesses. But once in the European community, you create a network of interests for those banks and businesses. As a result, those powers would refuse to back the adventurer, the dictator, for fear of losing all of those links. So that is essentially the idea behind linkage and democracy. And I think this was, very much in the 1990s was hugely important in a number of cases. Take a case like Romania, which no one in their right mind at the late 1980s under Ceausescu would think would be a stable democracy. Nonetheless, I think because of the ties with the European Union in the 1990s, it basically helped encourage democracy in Romania. And indeed, Romania has been a quite stable democracy for the last 30 or so years. It's had about 5 different democratic turnovers. And this, remember, this is a country which was under the sort of tight, sultanistic, highly personalistic rule of Nicolae Ceausescu. In 1989 was just about the only country in Eastern Europe to suffer a violent transition from communism. And few people expected it would be democratic. Nonetheless, it is democratic. And I think this can, to an important extent, be attributed to the European Union. Other cases, outside the European Union, in our book in 2010, in the Dominican Republic, we see that in 1994, President Balaguer tried to steal an election. Business abandons him, and he is forced to hold a democratic election and leaves power peacefully. I also think the impact of linkage can, and this is perhaps a bit more controversial, and I would be interested in your thoughts. I see the impact of linkage in China's behavior after the Russian invasion. Now, of course, I think China has been rightly criticized for not doing more to pressure Russia. Nonetheless, I think it could be a lot worse. I mean, I think that China has not provided Russia with significant military aid. It has done, for the most part, abided by Western sanctions against Russia. And clearly the reason is not because, this is despite of the fact that Xi Jinping, has a close relationship with Putin, and has declared tight, his commitment to Putin. And in China, you see, all sorts of misinformation about the war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But the simple fact is that the Western markets are $35 trillion, whereas the Russian market is $1.5 trillion, which is about the size of one province in China. So clearly this has sort of, hampered China's willingness to give full backing to Russia. And I think that if they had given full backing to Russia, I think, the outcome would have been much worse. Okay. So that's, I think here we have, reasons to think that, linkage has had an important impact. I think there's sort of ideas behind linkage and sort of and Ostpolitik, but also obviously, material self-interest encourage a dramatic increase in integration of Russia in the 1990s. You had, by the 1990s, Europe accounting for 40% of Russian trade in 2020. Russia accounted for was the 5th largest target of EU exports. And of course, there was tremendous energy dependence on Russia, in Europe, especially Germany, in the run-up to the full-scale invasion. Now, of course, my ideas, no one's really read that book outside of academia, but I mean, I have to say that the ideas in the 2010 book very much would support this effort to integrate with Russia, and the idea of kind of building linkage. The ideas behind this book of linkage would be the idea that governments should increase economic ties with countries like Russia, authoritarian regimes, as a way of encouraging them to liberalize. So, I mean, I think, this is very consistent. This kind of behavior is very consistent with the argument I make in my book. Now, I just want to sort of talk for a second, because I'm about to criticize liberal transnationalism. Just, I want to sort of talk about what a beautiful idea it is, and how sort of, the idea behind liberal transnationalism is that we all share common values. The idea is that all countries can democratize, and finally, you can do good by doing well. In other words, by simply sort of engaging in profitable economic transactions, you actually help in the process to spread sort of, liberalism and democracy. So, I think these ideas, explain a lot. They explain why the fact that, Eastern Europe, which before the fall of the Berlin Wall had no democracies, now, despite all the problems in Hungary and Poland and the like, still 2/3 of Eastern Europe are fully democratic by any measure, and there are no full-scale authoritarian regimes. Nonetheless, conditions have obviously changed since the 1990s, and especially in the 2000s. We really saw two phenomenon that really, directly challenged the ideas behind this, the ideas behind liberal transnationalism. Basically the rise of multipolarity. First of all, most importantly, the rise of China as a major economic power, with China having phenomenal economic growth. Since between 1978 and 2019, the Chinese economy has increased 13-fold in real terms. I mean, this is astounding. And of course, I don't need to tell anyone here that you've seen the rise of a much more aggressive Russia, beginning, I think, with the Orange Revolution in 2004, and then culminating in the 2014 invasion, and then the 2022 full-scale invasion. So I think this has had two impacts. First, I think what we see is that, looking back at my 2010 book, some of my ideas seem quite naive. The idea that sort of diffusion, the spread of ideas only happens in one direction, from west to east. That is clearly wrong. That what we found is that, and especially in the case of Hungary, that by integrating east and west, you don't just encourage democracy in the east, but you also encourage more authoritarianism in the west. And you see this specifically with the sort of fact that Viktor Orban has become a kind of model for populists and dictators in places like Austria, and most specifically my own home country of the United States. The idea of deep state as an excuse for politicizing the state very much, I think, came from both Turkey and Hungary. In other words, it came from countries that we used to think as the sort of object, as a sort of that we would influence them, but they also influencing us. Second, I think, and most importantly, integration has actually made it much harder for the West to punish autocratic abusers. And the sort of most clear example of this, again, is in Hungary. When it joined the European Union, it joined the European People's Party, which is a conservative party association in the European Parliament, and Orban became a sort of essential member of this EPP, and their vote was required, for EPP to succeed, and therefore it encouraged, people like Merkel and others to sort of ignore clear authoritarian failings of Orban. As a result, it took about 8 years of authoritarian behavior by Orban for countries to really realize that or Hungary was not a democracy, that it's in fact a competitive authoritarian regime. And this is again really attributable to integration itself, so that so that integration, rather than promoting democracy in Hungary, has actually helped it undermine efforts to punish autocratic behavior. And of course, I don't have to tell any of you, this is most obvious with Russia, which used integration really to sink its claws into the European elite. Putin is friends, buddy with Berlusconi. Schroeder, pictured here, received apparently about $1 million a year from various Russian oil interests. He called Putin a flawless Democrat. And it's really, we're only really now discovering the extent to which Russia really infiltrated much of the German elite. Arne Schoenbaum, the chair of the Cybersecurity Council in Germany, just in October was fired because it was discovered that he had ties to the Russian security services. It's been discovered that there was a tremendous effort by the Germans to avoid, quite mild sanctions imposed by the West after the 2014 invasion. They channeled it through a climate foundation. This is all sorts of corruption. And the point is here that, in fact, what we see in the case of Russia was that integration, rather than, preventing, the invasion of Russia to Ukraine, actually encouraged it, because it encouraged the belief by Putin that Europe would do absolutely nothing, to punish Russia, because they had ties to people like Berlusconi and Schroeder, and all sorts of interests and energy dependence and the like. And so the irony is that integration, which is supposed to prevent war, actually in this case encouraged war, because it gave Putin the confidence that nothing would happen bad to him. At the same time, you have obviously incredible Western dysfunction in the run up to the full-scale invasion, Brexit, the debt crisis, and the like. So again, all of this encouraged Putin to believe that that Europe would not present a real threat to Russia if it invaded. But then, of course, you have the momentous event of February 24th, 2022, which again, I don't have to tell any of you, the horrors involved, so I won't go into them. But I think it's important to recognize that this invasion, one of the main reasons why it has had such an impact on European politics is the sheer moral clarity of involved. This is so clearly Russia has so clearly been openly imperialist. There's evidence of quite a large amount of evidence of genocide. In part mainly because the Ukrainians were so brave in resisting. There were very few collaborators on the Ukrainian side. And so this was, this was a very much of a, this is very much of a kind of what I like to call kind of a Star Wars type conflict. You're Luke Skywalker and Russia is Darth Vader. And this is, very different from most of the conflicts I've studied in my life. I mean, I'm usually talking about how there's, things are more complex than you think. And then of course, with the Russian invasion, things are far more clear than people, expected. There's a clear good guy and bad guy. There's also, I think, invasion represented a clear, failure of liberal transnationalism. Again, integration that was supposed to, undermine war actually encouraged war. And as a result, I think led to sort of what I see as a kind of a rise of a new containment, For those of you who know a bit of Cold War history, containment refers to was the idea promoted by George Kennan, who worked in the American embassy in Moscow, right after World War II, and the Soviet Union and the United States obviously had an alliance during World War II, and he was in 1946 long telegram promoted the idea, both that the USSR and the West were in fundamental conflict, and also that the Soviet Union was inherently expansionist and that they need to focus explicitly on containing Russia. So I think that, what we saw with the response to the invasion on the European Union was something along those lines of an emerging form of containment, which is, very much opposed and antithetical to liberal transnationalism. You have, sanctions. So, despite the fact that the European Union, I think there are a lot of reasons to criticize the European response, but I think it's also important to remember just how dysfunctional the European Union was in the run-up to the full-scale invasion, and also we talked about the sort of energy dependence and the like. And despite all of those things, there was a very kind of rapid and unified response by most European powers, and obviously Hungary and Serbia accepted. Russian banks were taken out of SWIFT. Hundreds of Western companies left Russia, and there's been sort of billions of dollars in military assistance provided by the U.S. and Europe. Again, Germany, I think could be criticized for not providing battle tanks, for reasons that make no sense. But nonetheless, I think we see a kind of a real, quite dramatic shift in German policy from one in which Ostpolitik was sort of considered the accepted wisdom to one in which, very much resembles sort of a George Kennan type containment. So it's Steinmeier, who, obviously, Zelensky rightly refused to sort of, invite him to Ukraine in the spring of 2022. He made a very important speech in 28 October in which he talked about an epical break in Russian-German ties, and that, our countries are standing against each other today. Again, one level, this is utterly obvious to anyone who studies Ukraine, but in the context of, German politics of Ostpolitik, this represents quite a radical shift in their own politics. In my own country of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister, has talked about the fact that Russia does not share our values, and the importance of what she calls, others have called friendshoring, this idea that democracies should build supply chains with each other in order to sort of, make it harder for dictators to blackmail, democracies, as Russia tried to do with Europe. And so, indeed, I think, what we've seen in Europe is quite, a massive structural shift. This is just, one, figure here. We see that sort of, whereas EU was dependent on Russian gas for about 50% of its supplies, before the full-scale invasion, now it's down to about 17% in a very, very, very short period of time. And so it's just, this is really, I think when we look back, for those of you who study political economy, 2022, just, setting aside everything else, is going to represent a massive shift in the political economy of Europe. Obviously, you also, and part of this is driven by, gas demand has gone down. And certainly the European sacrifices are nothing compared to your sacrifices. But, nonetheless, there's been an effort to sort of reduce energy supply, and the like. And what we've seen is, for the first time in world history, an increasing global divisions, not, between basically the free and unfree. So in the Cold War, both sides, communism and capitalism had their own, had dictatorship. So communism, of course, was a form of dictatorship, and capitalism, you had some democracies in Europe, but you also, of course, had sort of right-wing dictatorships in Latin America. So what you see now is that really increasingly global divisions are between democracies and non-democracies. So on one side, you have Europe, which of course, is not all democratic. You have Hungary in there, but for the most part, it's quite democratic. And on the other side, you have kind of hodgepodge. People know what hodgepodge is? Ukrainsky? Hodgepodge. Anyway,
Hodgepodge? You
hodgepodge.
mean like no, I'm not sure. You can elaborate.
It means like very mixed, like makes no sense.
I think it's kasha malasha.
Kasha malasha, yeah. Kasha.
All right.
Right, yeah, sounds. You have like, a clerical Iranian regime just with, kind of kleptocratic Putin regime and, post-communist China. I mean, these are ideologically, they share almost nothing. The only thing they share is that the West hates all of them or is in challenging all of them. So, you see this sort of mishmash of a sort of, division between East and West. So I think, in that sense, we're really witnessing a profound shift. So I think at the same time, there are real threats to this containment. I mean, I think containment, less to be, I think is a very good thing. I think the West needs to sort of promote it. I see, basically, real threats to this, mainly from what I think is kind of a red-brown coalition, the red brown being sort of the communist, brown being fascist. So what's interesting about Putin is that, it's hard, I think, for me, obviously you, to really understand how anybody could find him attractive. I mean, that's insane, right? But for the radical right, both in Europe and the United States, they like him because he's authoritarian, right? That's what they want. They also like, he attacks social change, he's anti-gay and the like. And also on the left, there's more ambivalence, it's less clear, alliance. But, I think I have been, deeply disappointed by the left, journals like The Nation, Chomsky, who, they're very kind of apologetic towards Putin. And I think this has been, for two reasons. One, the left, as we've discovered now, Lula in Brazil, to a lesser extent, the Social Democratic Party in Germany, and the like, have really been driven by an intense anti-Americanism. And Putin has really been able to sort of use sort of anti-Americanism to get these sort of fellow travelers, these kind of useful idiots, and the like, to sort of encourage a sort of much more moderate response by the American and European left towards the invasion. So you see all these ridiculous calls for negotiation and the like. That I have to say, this has been the hardest for me because I have no friends on the radical right, but I have a lot of friends on the left. People who I went to school with, who I like personally, and then I see their views on Ukraine, and I can't talk to them. And so this has been, quite shocking to me. Also, I will have to say, among my in-laws, my wife is, her family is from Pakistan. And I discovered that my father-in-law, despite, he's a wonderful man, he's been living in Canada for decades, but he is sort of, Putin curious. He is sort of, has a sort of attraction to Putin. I'm like, well, how could you possibly, in Pakistan, how could you possibly be attracted to Putin? And it's because of Putin's anti-Americanism and it's sort of this, he's not supporting Putin per se, but he kind of is vaguely sympathetic towards him. And I think this is true of much of the global South, that sort of, they don't necessarily like, Putin, but they're sort of, they're willing to sort of talk to him. And this is obviously true with Lula in Brazil, who has, been refused to sternly criticize Putin, as well as, of course, the Pope, who in many ways is quite a wonderful Pope, but has been, quite awful in regards to the invasion. So to summarize, I think there's sort of what we've seen with the Russian invasion is a new era in global politics, in many ways a strengthened, more unified liberal world, the weakening of ideas of transnationalism, but I think, nonetheless, we still face, real threats to containment both from a red-brown coalition, obviously, I don't have to tell any of you, cold in the winter, inflation. The other thing is here, I think, is, and perhaps the biggest threat, which I haven't included here, is of course China, which I think it's relatively easy to isolate Russia. It's much harder to isolate China. Anyway, so I'll end it there. Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. Hi, Timothy. It's been a real pleasure to work with you guys. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Lucan, for your lecture and wonderful presentation. I apologize for a delay, and I also want to thank you for being so sufficient. So, because as far as I know, you introduced yourself and you just started to give this talk. It's very nice to have you as a a reliable partner and presenter. So we actually have a few students here with us. They also prepared the questions, and they will ask something that they've been meaning to ask for a while. But I want to start with a softball, or maybe not. I just want to warm up the atmosphere here. I know that you've studied this topic a lot, the transition between democracies and authoritarian regimes, and what does it mean to be a democracy? And the literature is vast, and it's often, especially we're talking about the comparative political science, it's often based on some sort of, indexes of democracy and quality of democracy. And now you bring these totally new dimensions of linkages and interrelations and partnerships between countries. So I wonder, do you think it's going to change the scholarship a lot? Do you think that people will start thinking about it in terms of networks and clusters? So can you reflect on the on the future of the field? I know it's not a very easy question, but I think it really reflects your career, and I'm pretty sure you have thought about it a lot.
Yes. Well, first of all, I think the definition of democracy itself is fairly straightforward. I mean, I think there's a broad degree of agreement. Basically it's free and fair elections in which opposition is allowed to run, and there is no government restrictions on media. I don't think, in contrast to other conceptual areas, this one is fairly straightforward. There is a debate on terms of, there are a million different measures, VDAM, Freedom House, polity, and the like. I have a personal dislike for these measures, and sometimes you have to use them because you have no choice, but because you don't really know, for example, in the case of Freedom House, what does a 3 mean, right? Or that's very abstract. Or in the case of VDAM, which is probably the best and most known measure, it's actually hard to pin down exactly what they're referring to. So they're good in terms of macro pictures. You have to use that, but I actually much prefer to get into the case. And on my book on competitive authoritarianism doesn't use any of these measures. I literally go through each of the dimensions and I measure each of them. And I've been doing that with Ukraine, literally for the last 25 years. So I think that's the case I know the best. Starting with Kravchuk in 1991. Now, in terms of how I think the demise of linkage, how that affects democracy, I think it's a real challenge. I mean, I think it means that countries like Hungary, being the obvious example, or Venezuela, or Nicaragua, that have very strong ties to the West, nonetheless have been allowed to drift away from the West. And I think that is something that is obviously a new and very troubling phenomenon. I mean, I'm less surprised by cases like Russia. Russia really was never democracy. So when people talk about democratic failure in Russia, I don't think that's the case. I mean, I think it's not a democracy, but there was never a democracy to fail in Russia, in a sense. I mean, it was, pretty close under Yeltsin, but, it's not really surprising to anybody who studies political science that a case like Russia, democracy, failed to take root. It's more surprising in cases like Hungary and Poland. So I think I can stop there.
Yeah, thanks. And I will ask one more question, and then I will pass it to the students. This new slide, the final slide you have here, it emphasizes some threats to containment, including inflation. So, you're talking about economics and economic hardships. And, we had a few lectures before. We had people like Charles Boyce, and we also had people like Bruce Bueno de Mosquita. So, different political scientists who emphasized that economic inequality is specifically like a significant key factor which can predict political landscape and political future of countries. So I wonder, do you distinguish economic growth from economic inequalities? Is this important distinction for you or not? So can you reflect on these differences between inflation, economic growth, inequality? Is there anything interesting in that for you and your model?
Well, first of all, I'm of course familiar with Bosch's work, and then Mosquita. I mean, I think I never really know what to do with inequality in terms of democracy. I mean, at some level, it kind of feels that it should be a problem, but it's actually quite hard to sort of identify. I like when I study causality, I actually like to see it. Watch it, observe it, not just see a correlation. I get, I'm not as good at statistics as you are, Timothy. So I don't, but so I like to actually see it. So when I sort of look at the impact of linkage, I can actually show the causal mechanism. I can see, that Yatsyk in Romania, cares about the West, and he shifts his behavior in response to Western intervention. With inequality, it's the sort of model initially presented by Bosch of sort of the rich resisting democracy because they have more to lose. There's just really no empirical evidence of that. Haggard and Kaufman have a really wonderful piece in 2012 in which they try to show it, it's completely unable to show it. So I guess with inequality, I'm willing to be convinced, but I just sort of I don't see it. But I could be wrong. And also you have a number of cases, Brazil, the United States, which have been highly unequal for a very long time, but have remained democratic. And and I don't think that the current crisis of democracy in the United States has much to do with inequality. So that'd be my response. I mean, I don't necessarily think that this threat really. This is more here. I'm more referring to sort of support for Ukraine rather than democracy per se. But I think inflation. I think I think I think there's more reason to think that inflation could undermine democracy in a sort of not so much in a well-established democracies in Europe, but in a place like Peru or the developing world, you could see sort of economic crisis undermining people's support for otherwise weak democracy. So there again, I think you can see the connection. I think economic crisis certainly in some cases has encouraged support for populism, and so I think I see that more directly.
Yeah, I see. Thank you. It's really it's quite interesting for us and our audiences, to put like a puzzle of different opinions and views on these developments. So I will let.
But actually, just before one thing I do want to say. That I think Steve and I have already writing a fourth book, or another book on the success, the resilience of democracy. So I actually am quite optimistic overall about the resilience of pluralism, and I'm happy to talk about that. I think there's certainly been a decline, but not nearly as much as people think.
Sure. So I guess we have to book you to book your book, and it would be wonderful to see you here in person, actually. So we'll extend the invitation. So maybe Andriy or Anna Maria, if you want to ask something, please go ahead. I will not how to say it, will not I'm sorry, my English deteriorates in evenings. So please, guys, take it from here.
Okay. So you mentioned that the Russian invasion exposed how severely the leading economies of Europe depend on Russian resources. And of course, the most exemplary case is Germany. And Angela Merkel, who was the chancellor of Germany for like 15, 16 years, is often blamed for the current dependence of Germany on Russian oil, gas, and energy. And what stood for this close integration with Russia? Was it just a naive belief of liberal Democrats from Europe, or was there some hidden influence of Russian lobbyists? And what could Merkel do differently to prevent the current state of things?
Well, I think, I think it's a combination of a lot of things. I think probably most important was material self-interest. I think, it's hard to believe that, like, when you're Gerhard Schroeder and you get $1 million a year from Russian oil companies, that doesn't influence your thinking. And I remember when I actually saw in 2010, this is, before any of this stuff, I saw Schroeder speak, and I really thought, well, he really was an advertisement for hypocrisy, because hypocrisy is when you say the right thing and do the wrong thing. And Gerhard Schroeder was saying the wrong thing and doing the wrong thing. So I'd much rather, hypocrisy, which you say the right thing and do the wrong thing, than saying the wrong thing and doing the wrong thing. Anyways, I think that, clearly Merkel, her big mistake, she should not have, it is appalling, that after the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014, that they went ahead with Nord Stream 2. Germany already was dependent on gas in the range of 55%. Why would you want to increase that even more is beyond me, in a way that sort of actively I think abetted, encouraged the Russian invasion, because they were not punished at all by the invasion of Crimea. And that was a huge mistake. And I think a lot of it is, a lot of the information is coming out that part of the reason was that there was sort of an enormous amount of economic benefit to Merkel's own home region near the border with the East. And that really affected her own policy views. And so I think, we rightly so, need to, rethink German politics and Merkel. At the same time, I think there is a sort of counter argument, which my colleagues here at the University of Toronto have raised, which is that, part of the reason for, integrating with Russia was not just, liberal transnationalism or corruption, although that certainly played a role, but it's also, you have to consider who are the other sources of energy, Saudi Arabia, Algeria. None of these are, now it's sort of clear, but, none of these are particularly, good democratic places. So that, so you have to, I think, a little bit sort of appreciate the dilemma that German policymakers were facing in the 2000s and 1990s, that, if you're sitting, before the full-scale invasion and before 2014, Germany was facing the choice of, do you get energy from Saudi Arabia or Russia or Algeria? And so, it's in that context, I think there's a little bit, you can more understand the choice of Russia, but, I think that's forgivable. What is not forgivable is what they did after the invasion of Crimea. I think that's just, there's no excuse for that.
Okay, then maybe Anna will ask her question.
Yeah, thank you for joining us today. And I also have a question about NATO. So where do you stand on the issue of Ukraine joining NATO in the future? Do you think it is possible? And maybe it can also be a part of such a containment policy toward Russia?
Yes, I think that joining NATO is is absolutely is necessary. And I think it's obvious to anyone that if if Ukraine had joined NATO before 2014, then Russia would not have invaded Ukraine. So I think that's yes. The question is how realistic it is, and I think that's a separate question. I mean, so morally, normatively, yes, but sort of realistically, it's harder to see Ukraine joining NATO until sort of there's victory of Ukraine over Russia, because I think that sort of one of the reasons why it was so obvious to me initially, it was obvious for a lot of reasons why Putin's invasion had nothing to do with NATO, was because Putin had already taken NATO off the table by invading Crimea, for the simple reason that NATO is never going to expand to a country in which there are conflicts over international borders. Because if they were going to expand to a country in which there's conflict over international borders, that puts NATO immediately into war, right? And so in that sense, as unjust as it is, it's clearly Ukraine after 2014, not even taking into account the full-scale invasion, was NATO would never expand to Ukraine because NATO is not going to sort of admit a partner who puts them on at war with a country like Russia. And so I think the question is, while Ukraine should definitely join NATO, it's hard to see it, at least in the short and medium term, that being necessarily happening. So I think a sort of more realistic and ultimately better, in addition to NATO, is a kind of more Israeli type approach, which I think is partly happening, which is Ukraine becoming just incredibly militarily powerful. So even short of NATO membership, it has, ultimately, as Ukraine knows, it's going to have to rely primarily on itself. And we've seen models of this. We saw dramatic strengthening of Vietnam between the early 1950s, in which it was an incredibly weak state, and after the conflict with France and the United States, where it became one of the strongest states in the world. I really see that as a model for Ukraine. I think it will be. I think Ukraine, in terms of sort of military capacities, clearly on the way towards becoming the sort of the Israel or the Vietnam of the post-communist region. And I think it absolutely needs NATO membership. It's going to need Western arms, but it also, I think, is in a position to resist Russian invasion primarily on its own military capacity. In that sense, it's different from the Baltics, who are way too small to ever rely on their military capacity. Ukraine, because of its size, I think, does have that capacity.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So do we want to do? No.
I also have another question. So
Yeah.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
So do you think it is possible that Russia will become democratic in the future? Because it seems to me that now Russian society is not cannot accept these democratic values. So do you think it can happen in the near future, or maybe in the next decades it is not possible?
I think, first of all, I think it certainly is possible, and I think people are wrong to sort of, just because Russia failed to become a democracy, in the 1990s, does not mean that it was impossible. I think there were real obstacles to it. One of my sort of optimistic scenarios, is, I don't necessarily think this is the way that it's going to pass. One of the things that made democracy hard in Russia was that in the minds of Russians, democracy was associated with the 1990s, which was this horrible period of economic decline. And perhaps, I'm not saying this is likely, I think, there's a possibility that now, because of the economic problems and the like, imperialism and aggression and autocracy will be associated with economic decline in the minds of Russians. But of course, I think, everything depends on getting rid of Putin, because, without, I mean, I don't think it's certainly not a guarantee that without Putin, Russia will be democracy, but I think, that's a necessary for that to happen. But yes, it's possible. I mean, although again, I mean, we could talk endlessly about, I mean, I have a webinar, many of you might be interested on, does the Russian opposition have a Ukraine problem? I did this several months ago. It was a very interesting discussion. And the bottom line is, as obviously all of you know, yes, it does. And so I think, you can look in our webinar channel on CERES, and you can see, very interesting discussion about the Russian opposition's awful, misunderstanding of Ukraine. And that's clear, but it's a separate question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this discussion. I will read out loud one question, which is in Q&A asked by our colleague, Alexandra Ködel. She's a faculty member of KC, and now she's in George Washington University. So she says that the idea of linkages as a mechanism for democratization of a recipient state is a very interesting one. She wants to comment on it. So she asks, should we also consider the reverse influence? By socializing, doing business with non-democratic elites, the elites of a democratic donor who are more flexible with their value orientation get strengthened thanks to profits from economic activity in the emerging market of the democratic states. So this is the proposed statement. You can agree or disagree. Should the whole idea of economic and social linkages be only applicable to states with a democratic core, or maybe deficient democratic institutions work as well? It's a long question. Maybe you can read it in Q&A. Everyone can read it in this box. So, but I think to put it in a very short, note, the question is about the reverse mechanism.
Yeah. So I think, it's interesting because I think, certainly it's possible, and I think that's what's going on right now. That was part of my argument, that you have sort of my initial argument in 2010 was seeing linkage as a one way from democratic West to authoritarian East. And now it's clearly, going, I think it's still going West to East, but also it's going from authoritarian East to democratic West. I think a lot of it depends on the global balance of power. That in this period, this wonderful period in the 1990s, when there were no real challengers to the liberal democratic United States, reverse linkage was much harder, and overwhelmingly the impact went from West to East because there was no sort of serious economic alternative. And so if you're deciding, if you're a business person or a potential dictator in a small country, your only choice is to rely on the United States or the European Union. And you're just, and you're not in a position to influence them. So all of that is changed again. If we look back, with the 2000s, when you saw the shift towards multipolarity. And in a condition of Western unipolarity, then linkage goes from West to East and not from East to West. But in the condition of multipolarity, it goes both ways. So that's my answer to that.
Yeah, thank you very much for for your answer, but also for this lecture. I think it's a good time to wrap up since it's quite late in Kiev already. Let me check quickly. Yeah, Alexandra just says thank you for your answer. Thank you, Lucan. We are looking forward, to have you more and to talk about your new upcoming books. I also want to remind our audience that you can follow our Facebook and Twitter accounts, Kyiv School of Economics. Next week on December 13, we are going to start a series of panels about urbanism, logistics, and urban planning during the war and reconstruction of Ukraine. So we look forward to see you online and offline on our events. Thank you, Lucan. Thank you for talking to our students, and yeah, we'll talk soon. Cheers.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.